Welcome to the Flourishing at School podcast. I'm Tamara Lechner. Each week, my co-host, Jason Van Schie, and I bring you the best practitioners, academics, and everything in between in order to inform best practice in whole school mental health. For the next 2 weeks, we are doing something a little different. In episode 17, we had Dr. Helen Kelly join us to talk about her new book. And way back in the day, Jason and his co-host Joelle on the Psych Health and Safety podcast introduced Helen. I felt like the tips that she shared and the research and the knowledge needed to be shared with our audience too. So we have taken an episode from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and split it into 2 parts for our audience. So you're going to hear Jason and Joelle talking to Dr. Helen Kelly. Let's get started.
From Flourish DX School, this is the Flourishing at School podcast. With mental health becoming a global priority, we are your partner for creating schools where students, teachers, and school leaders feel good and function well, becoming the best versions of themselves and contributing to a flourishing world.
She was a school leader across several schools for 15 years in Bangkok, Berlin, and Hong Kong, so well-travelled. She completed a doctoral thesis in 2017 on the subject of international school leader wellbeing. Following retirement from school leadership, her work now revolves around researching, writing, and speaking on a range of educational topics with a particular focus on school wellbeing. She's otherwise known as the Positive Principal. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Helen Kelly.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Well, Helen, it's great to have you join us from on the other side of the world. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
Me too.
So before we get into it, Helen, do you have any podcasts that you'd like to listen to?
I do, yeah. Over the last couple of years, there have been 3 podcasts that I've been listening to regularly. And yeah, none of them are really that connected with what we're going to talk about today, maybe loosely. So the first one is called Writer's Routine. I'm in the process of writing my first book at the moment. And I've been listening to Writer's Routine, which actually is not that helpful to me in writing my book because it's mostly focused upon fiction writers and my book is non-fiction. Nevertheless, I quite enjoy listening to authors talk about their routine, how they organize their day, how they go about writing, writing their books. It's something that I listen to a lot when I'm driving. The second one is Yoga Talks by Jay Brown, and this is a real nerdy one. This is for people that are interested in yoga philosophy and, the kind of deeper elements of yoga off the mat, as we say in the yoga world. And Jay Brown is a well-known yoga practitioner in the States who interviews a lot of other well-known yoga nerds. So it's just nerd fest for yoga, basically. And then the third one, which is a lot more well-known, is 10% Happier, Dan Brown, which you're both nodding. So I've been listening to him for a few years now. And, his podcast started with a focus upon meditation, but now he's expanded to a lot of other kind of mental well-being related issues, and he speaks to a lot of nerds as well. So yeah, I think actually all 3 of those podcasts are quite nerdy, aren't they?
That's all right. There's nothing wrong with a nerdy podcast.
Yeah, we like nerdy podcasts here.
We do, yes. So can you tell us about your professional career, please?
Yeah, well, my working life began not in education, actually. I began work in the late 80s after I left university. I was a solicitor in the UK. And I was working for a company that had really developed as part of the labour movement in the early part of the 20th century. So it was very kind of right on and progressive, kind of lefty politics involved there. And what we did was we acted for trade union members who'd had accidents at work or who'd contracted industrial diseases. Things like mesothelioma and asbestosis, industrial deafness, that kind of stuff. And there was a real commitment in the organisation to improve health and safety at work generally. And, back then we were working with common law negligence law, and also legislation going back to the 1960s, the Factories Act. But then in the early 1990s, all this wonderful legislation came in from the EU, which afforded workers a lot more rights. And so it was a great time to be working in that field. But then in the late 90s, my husband and I decided that we wanted to travel and work, and he was an engineer and I was a lawyer, and that didn't really fit together. So we both requalified to become teachers. And my first job was actually working in Cairo in an international school. And for the next 21 years, I worked primarily in international schools overseas, a short 2-year stint in the UK, which I didn't enjoy. And for 15 years of that time, I was a school principal. And I was a principal in 3 schools, firstly in Bangkok for 6 years, and then in Berlin for 3 years, and then in Hong Kong for 4 years. And eventually getting to a point where I was responsible for over 1,000 students and over 100 staff. And interestingly, in 2013, I started studying for my doctorate. And I decided to focus upon school leader wellbeing, because back then, 9 years ago, no one was talking about this really, especially in international schools. You know, there was some research, academic research, but it really wasn't in the public domain. And so that's when I started really getting interested in, you know, school wellbeing, particularly leader and teacher wellbeing. And once I'd finished my thesis and delivered that, I founded my website, The Positive Principal, and I started writing articles, which attracted a lot of attention. And then I also was invited to present at conferences and deliver webinars, that kind of stuff. And then I started carrying out my own research during the pandemic. And I think, you know, they say doctors make the worst patients. And so, unfortunately, in 2019, I actually experienced an occupational burnout. And as a result of that, I made the decision to retire from my work in schools. And so I worked for another year. And then in the summer of 2020, smack bang in the pandemic, I retired from my job as a principal. And my intention then was to have a quiet life. But of course, there's an enormous amount of need in the field of, you know, teacher and school leader wellbeing. And so I found myself conducting research to fill gaps, and working with schools, consulting, supporting individuals with their wellbeing. And so it's been quite a whirlwind really for the last year and a half, nearly 2 years now since I retired from schools. And so I wouldn't say that I'm doing this full time. I still have plenty of leisure time. But it's interesting now. I work with schools from all over the world, in multiple sectors, state schools, independent schools, international schools. So it's very interesting.
Fantastic. That's a bit of a winding career path, which I love to hear about. I think it's, you know, it's fantastic to hear about people who don't just sort of progress through the normal pathway into a career and into where they end up. So yeah, I always love when our guests have a bit of a diverse background.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, spending the majority of your life living overseas also kind of, you know, makes you a bit different. It gives you an amazing perspective. And I think it's really helped me to understand that while, you know, we all know, and I'll probably talk about this a bit more later, there is no one size fits all approach when it comes to workplace wellbeing. And all of these different sectors and different countries and, you know, different types of schools all have, and each individual school has their own unique issues. But actually what I've learned over the last 10 years is that there are themes, general themes that are broadly similar regardless of where people are working. And I think that's been quite helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Helen, we work a bit in schools ourselves. As you've just alluded to, there is so much work to be done, so much need in schools for both student and staff wellbeing. But what brought you to our attention was an article that you wrote that I saw on LinkedIn, and it was called "Teachers Are Not to Blame for Their Own Burnout," which was a very inflammatory kind of title, but right down our own line of thinking in relation to, burnout being an occupational phenomenon. But can you tell us what prompted you to write that article?
Yeah, actually, that title, originally it was an article written for Wellbeing in International Schools magazine. And the original title, my title, was The Myth of the Resilient Educator. And I had already written an article about a year and a half ago, The Myth of the Resilient Child. And then the article was picked up by school management, and they actually came up with that new title, which I think was much more eye-catching. And as a result of that, it got a lot of reshares. But, as I said to you earlier, I already had a background in this. Most of my interest has been in school leader wellbeing, but increasingly in teacher wellbeing. And when I first started out, really, I saw my role, and I shaped and fashioned my role as someone who was raising awareness. And that's what I was most interested in. I think of myself primarily as a researcher and a writer in a journalistic style. That's, the role of the journalist isn't to come up with solutions, is it? It's to raise awareness. And that's what I was most interested in. But then as we kind of, pushed on through the pandemic, the need for solutions became, increased, and people were coming to me all the time for, solutions. And, we've alluded before in our conversation the other day, Jason, to the limitations of the self-care approach. And I must admit, when I was first asked to come up with solutions, the self-care approach made me feel very uncomfortable. And I think that that's a lot to do with my background in workplace health and safety. I think firstly, I understood that self-care, approaches offer limited solutions. But also I think what's made me feel the most uncomfortable was that by focusing upon self-care, teachers building resilience, placing the responsibility on teachers, you're giving employers a free pass, and you're allowing them to abnegate their responsibility towards their employees, which was very much against everything I believed in and the background that I had come from in the legal profession. And so I was a bit stuck at first. If you'd come to me 2 years ago, I was a bit stuck as to where to go with the solutions. And then I started researching for my book, which was commissioned about 15 or 16 months ago. And I'll talk a little bit about my book more later, I think. But while researching for my book, I got much deeper into the work of Maslach and Leiter and other researchers who have used Maslach and Leiter's work as a framework for their own, a springboard for their own research. And finally, I had an evidence base to establish, demonstrate that actually stress and burnout in the workplace are issues of the system and the organization, and not primarily issues of the individual. And therefore solutions had to be focused upon the system and the organization rather than upon the individual. And once I started to pick my way through that, the scales fell from my eyes, really, a light bulb moment. And that really helped me to understand how I could start developing solutions, particularly for schools as organizations. And when I use the word schools, I mean as a collaborative process between governance, leadership, and staff to develop, organizational approaches to reduce stress and prevent and mitigate against burnout. And so that was really what prompted that article, was to help schools to be aware of this and hopefully to prompt them to think in different ways about their wellbeing programs for teachers and leaders.
Yeah, I think it's such an important insight, and you have the ideal background, I guess, to be able to share that insight, given that, you know, you've been a school leader for so long yourself, have that workplace health and safety and legal background, and
Yes.
obviously are very good at communicating with school leaders about these things, because there are heaps of solutions in the school space regarding resilience and wellbeing and social emotional type skills, all focus on individual behaviors. But like you say, it kind of abnegates the employer from any responsibility of creating a healthy workplace that doesn't harm people or make them ill in the first place. So, really interesting, and really glad that you're taking that framework and bringing that to schools.
Yeah, I feel so comfortable with it now. It makes perfect sense for me. And it took me a long time to realize, actually, I know it sounds obvious now, but it took me a long time to realize that the reason I'd become interested in this was because of the background that I had in my first career. And this was just picking that up and, you know, from where I left off in a way. And of course, back then, in the late 80s to late 90s, you know, stress in the workplace was there was no framework at all for that. It was really very much something that we talked about that was in its absolute infancy. And I think that things have moved on quite a bit. And, you know, even if there isn't a legislative framework as kind of robust as we would like it to be, there's a research foundation there now for us to use, and to help us to develop tools. And so, yeah, I'm really glad I've come back to this. It feels natural, feels like it was meant to be.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because, you know, you referenced Maslach and Leiter there, and obviously we've had Michael Leiter on recently on the podcast as well to talk about a bit about burnout and incivility. And that research goes back decades, right? Regarding burnout and the workplace's, I guess, involvement, I guess, in burnout rather than just the individual's inability to cope. But you see, and I've definitely seen it being involved with schools myself. You have wellbeing academics who will come up with terms like contextual wellbeing, or a more recent one I've seen is systems and informed positive psychology. Yeah. And all they're really talking about is, you know, work design and psychosocial risk management. Like, well, they kind of put a new term on it to fit into the wellbeing kind of framework that they live in, or the world that they live in. But it's like, well, no, there's a whole field of psychology devoted to this area.
Absolutely. You know, before I already felt this in my bones, if you like, before I had the research kind of framework to hang it all on. And when I was working with my staff in my school in Hong Kong, you know, maybe 5 years ago, I was talking then about what about if we create an environment where everybody can flourish? But I didn't have the kind of research to hang it on at the time, but I knew that that was what made sense. And that's what we're talking about, isn't it? We're talking really about improving working conditions. And, you know, the thing that improved physical health and safety conditions in the 20th century was legislation, basically. Employers sat up and took notice because they knew that if they didn't, they could be sued. You know, you have workers' compensation in Australia, you know, but in the UK we have a whole legal profession built around civil litigation for this, and we don't have that yet, do we, for mental health risks? And so we have to persuade employers in other ways to demonstrate to them the bottom line benefits, whether that be financial or in schools. The bottom line is student outcomes, isn't it? That's the core purpose of the school. And actually, even in the state school system, student outcomes impact the bottom line as well, because it's a competitive environment and we're all competing for the same students. And if our exam results are good, which is what everybody wants, whether that's right or wrong, you know, exam results is where it's at. If student outcomes are positive, then families will want to come to the school and the school will be successful. And so it's just helping schools to understand how the well-being of their staff impacts the bottom line, because we don't yet have a framework of legislation, hanging over employers.
Yeah, so that's part of the carrot, right? Like looking at what are the things that the company is interested in, what are the outcomes that are expected or desired, and then how does wellbeing kind of map onto that? In Australia, obviously, we do have new regulations that are coming out at the moment. So Victoria, have released their draft regulations on psychological health, and we're expecting the Commonwealth ones imminently. We will have more of a stick approach, and the regulators are hiring a lot of psychologists who will no doubt be enforcing the new regs as they come out. Hopefully, like you said, when it came to physical health, what really drove behavioural change for employers was legislation. So hopefully this helps starting here in Australia. But I just conscious of the fact that there's not a lot of research regarding school teacher burnout. There's quite a bit around school leader burnout, and Phil Riley in Australia does a fair bit of work on principal wellbeing here. But do you have any statistics on how large the burnout issue is for school teachers, either in UK or internationally?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's an under-researched field in a sense. There's a lot of research, going back a few decades about the causes of teacher burnout, but not the incidence of teacher burnout. But we do have some data. What we know is probably about half of all teachers are likely to experience burnout at some point in their career. But we also know that probably around about 15% of teachers experience high levels of burnout. We know a few other things as well. We know that when teachers come into the profession as novice teachers, I'm thinking about the Maslach and Leiter engagement, burnout continuum. When teachers come into the profession as novice teachers, they come in at the engagement end. Hopefully they're not already moving towards burnout before they've even started. And what we know is that they can move pretty quickly through those profiles of exhausted and overextended and ineffective, in whatever order that might come for the individual, towards burnout quite quickly. And we know that retention of teachers within the profession is actually quite closely connected to this. So what we also know is that across, most of this data comes from the UK and the US, about 1 in 6 teachers leave at the end of the first year, leave the profession.
Wow. Yeah.
And then within 3 years, about 25% are leaving. And then within 5 years, about a third are leaving. And what tends to happen with those novice teachers is they become burnt out very quickly. They don't pace themselves or take time off sick. They just work harder to try to push through the problems that they're encountering. And as a result, they burn out. What we also know is that this isn't the case for more experienced or veteran teachers. So teachers who get through that initial stage and they've been in the profession for 5 years or more, what tends to happen with those individuals is that they will pace themselves more and they will take time off sick, but they don't leave. So what we've got effectively are millions of teachers around the world who are working while they are burnt out. And we know that there's some good research coming out now. The University of York in the UK, some fabulous research just from 2020. We're starting to understand the impacts of this, not just on teacher turnover, but just to talk about turnover a little bit. What we know about turnover is not only are teachers more likely to leave the profession if they're burnt out, but we also know that for teachers, for schools, teacher retention is also directly linked to student outcomes. So when we have schools where there's a lot of turnover, what we tend to have are lower student outcomes. And that's the case even for students who are taught by teachers who've been in their post for years. So actually the turnover of teachers impacts the teachers that stay. It impacts the culture of the school. It impacts collaboration. It impacts a whole bunch of things. So teacher turnover isn't just about the cost of replacing teachers. It's about the impact on the quality of the work that schools are doing. What we also know now, and this great stuff that's come from York University, a meta-analysis of studies that involved 5,000 teachers and 50,000 students. We know that teachers who are burnt, students who are taught by teachers who are burnt out, have poorer outcomes. So they have poorer exam results. They're also more likely to display disruptive behavior. They're less motivated. And also really interesting, although we haven't managed yet to prove a direct connection through contagion theory between teacher burnout and student burnout, what we have got is evidence pointing to students who are taught by burnt out teachers exhibiting more physiological signs of stress, such as increased levels of cortisol. So we've got a whole package of stuff there that we do know. We've got some data on the incidence of burnout, and we've also got a growing body of research around how this impacts schools, which I think is quite, interesting to say the least.
Yeah, well, it's eye-opening, and it really should send alarm bells. I mean, there's a lot of schools that are very conscious around student wellbeing, and they'll have quite elaborate programs, invest a lot of time and resources into these programs, but they won't necessarily have the same level of care or attention to staff wellbeing. And if it is staff wellbeing, it might be, well, let's run a day or two of staff PD on resilience. It's not like looking at the systems that are broken that are causing them to burn out in the first place. So if we're looking at what is more important for student outcomes, is it, wellbeing programs in the school, or is it, teachers not burning out so they and not turning over so they get higher quality education? They're both important, right? But but one seems to get a lot more attention than the other.
Well, I think there's a way to connect those two things. They're not separate, are they? It's like in the book that I'm writing at the moment about school leader wellbeing, you can't separate out school leader wellbeing from teacher wellbeing because they have a knock-on effect. And likewise, you can't separate out student wellbeing from the wellbeing of teachers and leaders. And in international schools in particular, you can't separate any of that out from parent wellbeing either, because parents are a very important part of the school community. But the way to kind of link all of that together is through positive school culture. And if you have a positive, if you're intentionally setting about to develop a positive school culture, this is going to impact positively on leaders, teachers, parents, and students, and other staff. We're not just talking about academic staff either, are we? We're talking about non-academic staff. So I think that, for example, we started a program of positive education in my school in Hong Kong. I drove that, and I felt very strongly that for the first year that had to be focused, entirely on staff. So first of all, that's because of the connection between staff wellbeing and student wellbeing, but also if staff are working with these tools and strategies for their own benefit first, it helps them to understand them better. So if you're using character strengths, for example, and you're going to move forward with using that with your students, it's much better to spend a year just doing that with staff. So I don't think that it has to be an either or. There are approaches that we can use that link all of this together. And I think that the forward-thinking schools, the schools that get it, are understanding that, but they are nowhere near enough. We're really just, the majority of them are ticking a box and want some of them care what staff think. They want to give staff the impression that they care about them, but they don't care about them enough to make the meaningful change that needs to happen. So I think we've still got a long way to go.
Yeah, we learned pretty early on when we started working with schools, this is going back to 2014, that we needed to pivot our approach. We had plenty of schools who wanted to use our school product for students, but they didn't want to use it with staff. And so what we did was bring in a policy that we wouldn't allow you to use it with students unless you were using with staff as well. So like you say, doing this whole school approach versus just focusing on the students, because we just knew it wouldn't be effective if you're not bringing staff along for the ride as well. And now we are seeing some schools who are, bringing in for staff a full year ahead of bringing with students, like you did in Hong Kong, to give them the skills, the language, the ability to practice some of these interventions out on themselves before sharing it with students.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are a couple of things that play there. I think first of all, we have to bear in mind that the individuals who are often responsible for improving teacher wellbeing are school leaders. The school leaders are exhausted and finding it difficult to sustain the workload and demands that they're experiencing. And so, they're going to focus upon students because it's hard. They've already got a lot to do. The other thing to bear in mind, though, I think, is that those directly outside of schools who are responsible for this, school governance, governments, public opinion or whatever, there's still a lot of anti-educator sentiment going on. And I think a lot of that stems from the fact that everyone perceives that teachers have 13 weeks holiday a year, and therefore why should they be burnt out? They don't have to, work, and they finish at 3:30 every day. And I think it's a lack of understanding among even those in school governance, certainly those in government and the population at large, of just what's involved in working in schools, just how challenging it is, and just how close to being overwhelmed many people are. And I think it's only really been through the pandemic that we've started seeing awareness being raised around this. And I think what many need to understand is that this didn't just happen through the pandemic. This has been going on for decades, and it's not going to stop when the pandemic stops,
Yeah, I agree. I think, a lot got found out in the pandemic. We found out how overloaded our hospital systems and our healthcare workers were already before the pandemic. And now we've had, 2 years of them having to work through that in extraordinary circumstances. And then teachers coming into our homes through Zoom with distance or remote education, I think, and parents having to do a little bit themselves, starting to recognise, maybe teachers do actually have a hard time.
Absolutely.
So I guess getting back to the article that you wrote on teachers and burnout, and given that the majority of school-based interventions are focused on that individual self-care focus, what was the reception like for your article?
Well, it's interesting. There are 3 articles I've written in the last couple of years that have received the most attention. The first one was about the loneliness of international school leaders, and that was read by thousands and thousands of people. Then the second one was the myth of the resilient child, which prompted this original article, The Myth of the Resilient Educator. And in the same way, this article also really kind of grabbed people, and this has now been my most reshared article on social media. So it's garnered a lot of attention. I've seen a few organizations coming to me in the last few weeks wanting to take a more systemic approach, but most of them still just want a box to tick, but it takes time for these ideas to permeate, doesn't it? And I think what we need as well are some role models. We need some high profile schools to take this on and show others how it can be done. I mean, the whole idea of happiness in schools went back to Wellington College in the UK. I mean, I know you've got Geelong, doing fantastic work.
Yeah, with Anthony Seldon there. Yeah.
Yeah, but Anthony Seldon did amazing work, what we're talking about 30 years ago, maybe, promoting happiness in schools. And he was a very high profile headmaster in a very high profile school in the UK. Which meant he got a lot of media attention, even on the kind of 6 o'clock news and things like that. So what we need are some high profile schools or groups of schools to really take this on, so that others can see how it can be done and learn from those models. And I'm working with a couple of groups of schools at the moment who I think really do get it. And hopefully, but it's early days, hopefully a couple of years down the line, we'll be able to use those schools as models of how this can be done. Because I think, schools do want solutions, but it all just seems too hard, too expensive, too time consuming.
Yeah, and I guess they want the evidence to show that that investment of their time and effort is actually going to have the benefits.
Absolutely. And, all of the data that we have on ROI, return on investment, all comes from the corporate world. We don't have any of that in schools at the moment. So we do need to have, as you said, a kind of body of evidence to draw upon, which I think will move things forward. And hopefully, I think we're getting towards that now, but it's still slow.
Yeah, so hopefully in the next year, we'll be able to share some research findings from our clinical trial with Monash University on school teacher mental health in Victoria. So that was part of a Workwell funded initiative, and there's about 30 schools involved. So talking about a body of schools, or, a number of schools taking more of a systemic approach and then researching the benefits of that. Yeah, hopefully there's a bit of data we'll be able to share, with our listeners and with people like yourself who can then disseminate that and go, well, look, there is schools doing this, and these are the benefits that they're realizing.
That's great. There's some great work going on in Victoria, also with school principals. I refer to this in my book, and it's good. Australia really have been leading the charge, in school wellbeing from a whole range of perspectives, including the great work that Geelong has been doing, and the university in Melbourne, and working alongside Martin Seligman, and some great stuff been going on there. So we've got a lot to learn from you.
Thanks, Jason and Joelle. This has been a great part one of our conversation with Dr. Helen Kelly. Join us next week on the Flourishing at School podcast to hear part 2. And in the meantime, you can feel free to connect with Jason and I on LinkedIn, or to jump over to our YouTube channel and subscribe to the Flourishing at School podcast on the Flourish DX platform. Until next time, keep flourishing at school and in life.
You've been listening to the Flourishing at School podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on whole school mental health, follow Flourish DX School on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Flourishing at School podcast at www.flourishingatschool.com.